There we go. Now we have progress. Okay, I'll start it all over again. So sorry. I'm Doug Miller here in Montreal with the Canadian Anti-Apartheid Activist History Project, and Jane Armstrong and Ken Trainer in Toronto for their alumni of the SACTU Solidarity Committee.
Try Lucart, not
Ken Lucart. Boy, now I'm blowing it all. And Evert Hoogers in Ottawa, and is a retiree from the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. Everett, welcome and good morning to you.
Thank you.
Could you just please acknowledge that you have read the consent form and you understand that we're going to be using this for public purposes?
Yes, I understand.
Thank you. So could you just then give us a little bit of your personal background and how you got involved in unionism and anti-apartheid work for that matter?
I was hired by Canada Post in 1972. That was following a few years at university. So many people were doing in the 1960s. And what was interesting about the time that I was hired by Canada Post was that it followed the 1971 CUPW convention, in which one policy had been passed that had to do with international work. And it was a policy somewhat awkwardly worded, but nevertheless a policy that opposed apartheid and called for sanctions against the South African regime. So I wouldn't say that that meant that it was widely publicized at the time, but those of us who were active in the union knew about it. But just as importantly, in 1974, a resolution was passed at that convention that said that all union policies were an integral part of the Constitution and had to be included in the Constitution that was distributed to every member across the country. So there was some background there already that indicated that the union was prepared to do something around the anti-apartheid fight. The problem was we didn't really know what to do other than to talk about the necessity that apartheid had to be defeated, and that was where the role that emerged with SACTU made a great difference. So that was sort of like the start of where it came from.
And you were based where at the time?
I was based in Vancouver.
Is that your home province?
It is. Yes.
Okay, good. And as a member of CUPW, did you get actively involved in union politics from the beginning?
Yes, I did. By the time I started at Canada Post, I was convinced that it was necessary to build the union movement, and I had already become convinced that trade unionism was an important part of the building socialism that I was also convinced was necessary. So yes, I was active as I could be. In those days, there was a period of time in which you were on probation. But the day after I got off probation, I was sworn in as a shop steward, and was an activist following that period. And in 1980, I became local president.
1980 local president of the Vancouver CUPW.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, interesting, fantastic. So as I recollect, SACTU Solidarity committee was just starting around 1980.
May of 1980. Yeah.
It was not as active in Vancouver at that point. I think that there was a lot of action around SACTU in the east around Toronto, but the others, Jane and Ken, can correct me on this. But I wasn't aware of SACTU activity in 1980 in Vancouver.
No, you wouldn't have been. I racked my historical brain last night. I can tell you for certain that the first connection we made at a local level with CUPW was in Vancouver during Zola Zembe's 1981 trip. And I remember standing outside the building, I forget what street it's on, where you had your meetings, and waiting for someone to come out and bring us in to introduce Zola Zembe to your membership. Of course, you were president, and in those days, we had to confront with smokers at meetings and things like that. Zola was an adamant non-smoker, so he wasn't happy with the environment in terms of the smoking, but he certainly loved the response from the membership. That was the first connection, May of '81. Or
Yes, I
yeah,
remember.
May of '80, yeah.
I remember that meeting well. It was in a basement hall that we had on Richard Street.
That's it, yeah. That's where I first met Sherry Hillman and Marion Pollock as well.
Oh, yes. All right. So, yeah, and of course, that meeting that was addressed by Zimba really inspired people in the local, quite a number of them. And of course, following that, it became apparent that there could be work done through the Sector Solidarity Committee. And one of the interesting things about the meeting with Zolazambe was that there was a couple of our members there who were actually from South Africa, white South Africans, who were quite initially, they were somewhat skeptical that there could be someone, a black South African worker could come and tell them what was going on in South Africa. But both of them ended up being totally convinced by the work that, by the words that they heard from Zola and the program that Zola outlined for them about how solidarity could be built.
That's a tremendous vignette, given what we know of white South Africa from that period. And the problem with white workers' relationships with black workers too. So wonderful. So from there, you're union president. Any particular events apart from that stand out? You spoke about a solidarity committee there.
It was heartening for me to see that there was a real opening throughout the union. We began to get letters and bulletins from national office. We became aware that Jean-Claude Perrault, who was national president at the time, had met Zola and was very impressed, and as a result was encouraging locals across the country to become active in sector work. So that became a source of hope for us. And I'm somewhat fuzzy on some of the activities in the intervening period between 81 and 83 or so. I'm very much clearer on some of the work that was been done about 1985 and 86, as things had developed that included a whole lot of locals besides CUPW, and was a result of the work of the Solidarity Committee in Vancouver.
I'd like to add a story that goes with Zola meeting JC back in the early days. I can't remember the exact date, but it was fascinating to us who was with Zola that Jean-Claude Perrault was actually in meetings with Canada Post management. Jeff Bickerton, the research director, had organized to meet JC, and JC actually canceled or walked out of his meetings with Canada Post management to meet a South African he'd never met before. Very
Tremendous.
memorable in my mind, and they hit it off right away. And of course, as I said, JC then, like Bob White with the CAW, circulated a letter to all the local unions encouraging them to support our work in Canada with the educational, research, fundraising, etc. So that meeting that you mentioned, Everett, was quite historic in terms of the beginnings of a relationship that lasted throughout the years of our work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it convinced Jean-Claude that throughout his years as president of the union, he would be making sure that international solidarity were part of the things that were being done in CUPW. It included the work that he did around Chile, for example. He was very involved in Chile work.
Yeah.
So one of the things that happened was that as we went forward, the policies of the union developed as well, and largely, again, as a result of the work that SACTU had done. We actually had a policy by the mid-'80s that said that the union would support all of the work of SACTU across the country. A while later, after CUSATU had developed, the policy that had included SACTU became a policy about labor internationalism and the need to understand that what was happening around the world was based on the growing globalization of capital, and that our international work was going to be based on that understanding.
And it was a time of rising neoliberalism. So the union was under as much attack as South Africa was facing its problems with apartheid.
Oh, yes. And it was, as I think you could say that it assisted us in getting a better understanding of how neoliberalism was going to work, because SACTU had also insisted that the issue of apartheid was not just a matter of racism, it was also a matter of capitalism, and it was the intersection of those two issues that made it important for the trade union movement to internationally work against apartheid.
Tremendous. And I always, well, the comparison is the struggle in South Africa was very difficult. And I remember CUPW was almost always on the leading edge of public service struggles and pushback by management. So you guys led the struggle on all fronts there. Jane, where should we go from here?
I'm just wondering, in terms of your recall, it's similar to most of us, a bit fuzzy. We had to twig each other's memories. And I'm wondering if you remember in 1986, we called for a national week of action across the country by union locals. Do you remember any of that?
I remember that very well, yes. I remember that very well because we had a discussion about that in our local executive as that week approached, and decided that what we would do was ensure that none of the mail in the international section of the post office would get out for one day. And that involved a considerable amount of organizing, because we had to convince people that it was worthwhile facing the prospect of discipline, to do that, to express the way in which the union was committed to the issue of anti-apartheid. And the surprising thing was that while it was successful, there was no discipline. There was never an attempt to try to suspend anybody over it. I think that there was some recognition that probably wouldn't have been a very good PR move by postal management. Then I remember as well, there was, I think in the same week, we were all out on the docks when a boat from South Africa had a ship from South Africa had come into Vancouver. And I guess it was ILWU that had organized at that point to ensure that ship did not get unloaded that day.
Yep.
ILW is International Longshoremen's Workers Union.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's amazing. Did in fact it dock at the end, or it was just held up for a while?
It docked, but there was nothing coming off it.
Okay. Kind of a useless trip. Yeah. So that's 86. You're still out in Vancouver as a local president. Ken, I see you have something.
Well, since we're talking about the whole relationship between CUPW and SACTU, there's one other story I want to have on record. It goes back to one of the trips Zola made to Canada, whether it was 81 or 83, I'm not quite sure. But in Ottawa, the postal workers had decided in good political fashion to celebrate May Day. which, as we all know, is not a particularly popular day in the history of the Canadian labor movement since the Cold War. So anyway, the postal workers had planned a big event, and I don't know whether it was nationally derived or locally derived, but anyway, Zola was with us in Ottawa at that time. And the mistake that was made by the local organizers is that after a rally, they opened the bar an hour earlier before the speakers were to speak. So given a new spring event after a typical Canadian winter, people hadn't seen each other. It was a pretty rowdy event the first hour. People had a lot to drink. So then they began to introduce the speakers. Well, Jean-Claude is smart. He knew that that was not the time to speak. So he passed on his opportunity to speak. He would speak later at some other time. So the next speaker was to be Al Campbell, who you may not know, but Al Campbell was kind of the Tommy McGrath of Central Canada. He was well respected by Labour as being a very left-leaning leadership. And his partner, his wife, Jeannie Campbell, was an activist within CUPW. So Al was called upon to speak, and the crowd wouldn't be quiet. Al gave up after many efforts to get their attention. So guess who's the next speaker? Zola. Well, we all know Zola. So Zola was listening to this rowdy crowd, and he also doesn't like drinking as well as not like smoking. So he was caught in his own contradiction. So I'll never forget this. He stood there in front of this crowd. It was noisy, with microphone in front of him, and he simply said, "I will not speak." Nobody heard him. He just kept repeating that line, "I will not speak." Till eventually there was a little bit of a silence in the crowd, and he was still saying, "I will not speak." And he eventually finished the sentence, "I will not speak until you respect me." Evert shut up. And he gave his talk. It's one of those moments in history that you were part of and you never forget. The silence was as loud as the noise had been. And it was an incredible relationship between a leader from South Africa and the rank and file in Canada. So that's a story I wanted on the record because it's one of the things that I remember very distinctly from our work.
I hadn't heard that story, I must say.
That's a good one, that's for sure. And it's a tribute to Zola's character and charisma that he could pull it off. The other thing, Ken, earlier you had made a very strong point about public sector workers versus the private sector workers.
Yeah, we weren't on the speaker yet, but what I wanted to say is that we who did the work for SACTU in Canada often give the CAW Canada most of the credit for the work that was done, the depth of the work. And I think we have to also acknowledge that CUPW, from the beginning, from those early meetings with the leadership in Ottawa and the locals like Evert in Vancouver, was with SACTU for as long as any other union in Canada. Regional education programs, strike fund contributions, boycotting, as you said, in '86, a week of action. CUPW deserves the same credit that CAW Canada does.
Office space in Toronto.
Point well made. Had a fire in our first location, probably set by the landlord. We couldn't prove that, but anyway, we were then offered space in the local CUPW office just up the street on Broadview, and we appreciated that. It was very minimal charge, and we then moved up the street, and that was our base for the rest of the time.
Yeah. The fact that CUPW had given space to SACTU had, I think, an important effect on the rest of the country, because it meant that that was a definite indication of how serious the commitment of the CUPW Toronto Local was. I think it was Eric DePaul was the president about that time.
Yep.
But it certainly affected us as well. Well, we said Toronto has provided space for SACTU to work. That means that they're serious about supporting SACTU.
Very much so.
Good stuff. Jane.
Just one other event in 1986, and I don't know whether you recall this, but not long after the week of action, the Canadian Labour Congress convention happened. I think it was late April, early May. And there was a significant amount of organizing across the country by many unions to send in resolutions. As I recall, there were close to 100 resolutions. And there was a speech by Jay Naidu, who was the leader of CUPW. And CUPW had been recently formed, but also in that spring had signed a memorandum, isn't quite the right term, but a joint declaration from CUPW, SACTU, and the ANC before he came to the CLC convention, just a couple of weeks before. And I'm wondering, do you remember that CLC convention? Because it was quite a watershed.
It certainly was, and I do remember that very well. And I think that one of the interesting background things to this is that, yes, there was a speech by Jay Naidu, but that was over the objections of the CLC leadership, or at least the International Affairs Department of the CLC leadership. And in fact, the convention began to chant at a certain point that they wanted Jay Naidu to speak. They brought him over from South Africa, and he was supposed to sit there. While other representatives from Denmark and Sweden and Germany talked about their important international work, Jay Naidu was supposed to sit there and not say anything. Well, this did not go over well with the delegates that were elected to the CLC convention. And that's one of the things that I remember most about it, is how the pressure mounted, and eventually the CLC leadership had to give in and give Jay the opportunity to speak.
My goodness gracious. This is unbelievable, that International Affairs Department.
But that raises also a point I would like to make politically about the CUPW, and that is the CUPW didn't look to central labor bodies for its direction. It didn't worry about whether the CCU unions, the Canadian unions that we have discussed and interviewed some people from, was a part of the CLC. It didn't look to the ICFTU in Brussels or in Europe for its direction. It didn't worry about the Cold War. It went ahead and organized people and did educational work on the issues of the day in terms of socialism, capitalism, and the issues that all unions should have been focusing on. So that's something I remember so clearly about anytime I went to a CUPW function. I didn't have to go through the initial preambles. I mean, I didn't have to do that. I could jump much further, much quicker. That's who you were, who you are.
And one of the things about that convention that Jane was mentioning was how it revealed that there were a whole lot of other, at least elements of other unions there that completely agreed with us. And that it was absolutely inappropriate, the position that was being taken by the International Affairs Committee, not the committee, but the department. And I think it reflected something that had been going on for quite some time. It just sort of blew up at the convention, but there was a lot of dissatisfaction that had been developing for quite some time, not just from CUPW, but from other unions as well, with the misdirection that was being given us by Robin Harper, I think his name was.
John Harker.
John Harker.
Yeah. So that was an important thing that happened, and I think it was important as well to the CLC in respect to what happened as a result of that. There was a growing understanding, and it developed particularly when Bob White was president, of the necessity of actually developing real ties with workers in countries, and not simply through some kind of condescending, we'll give you some money and we'll talk about how good we are in dealing with international crises and workers' crises.
Could you sort of see any, reflecting back now, were there any parallels with how the union was also dealing with gender issues, environmental issues, Indigenous issues, anti-racism, etc. here in Canada?
Yes, well, I think all of those things are always in some way related. It wasn't, as I mentioned earlier, it was one of the clear messages that we were getting from the Sector Solidarity Committee was the way in which race and capitalism intersected in the issue of apartheid, and I believe that is also the same kind of motivation that gave rise to the work that was being done, particularly by the growing number of women activists in the union to push for more equity, to push for a union that embraced equity and diversity. That's still going on. But yes, I think that all of those things are related and are what give rise to a healthy union movement if they're accepted as part of how a union grows.
And I mean, you talk so freely about passing resolutions and so on, but and education, but I understand the union work very well, and sometimes this is a lot more work than just simply passing a resolution. You've got to have sessions and educational. Could you describe a little bit of that kind of work that you and your union got involved in?
Well,
or the step-by steps of it?
You're absolutely right. The process was somewhat different at the beginning. In the 80s, we were able occasionally to have regional conferences where we would get together with other activists from other locals. And then, of course, later on, in the 90s, we followed the direction of CUPW and came and were able to get our version of their PEL course established, and that made a considerable improvement in our ability to get education around a whole series of issues that confronted the union.
Good. And what other links would you have had? Obviously, unions have union links to conventions and labor congresses and so on. Did you have any other links with groups other than the unions, churches, for instance, or the NGO world?
Well, during the time that I was local president, one of the things that happened was something called the emergence of the Solidarity Coalition and Operation Solidarity, which was the result of, I guess we could say now, we used to call it, I think, supply side economics, but it was under the social credit regime of Premier Bill Bennett that he attempted, or in fact did introduce the first full-blown sort of neoliberal policies, economic policies in British Columbia. And there was a response, a big response from the labor movement and from the community. I'm not going to get into all of the details of that, but it certainly brought together, at least in the initial stages, the best impulses that you can imagine from trade unionists throughout the province. And at that point, the ability to work with women's organizations, with Indigenous organizations, anti-racist organizations, because there was all a common program that people understood was important. Didn't quite end on a positive note. It was undercut by the leadership of the largest unions in British Columbia, and unfortunately, the fact that it ended that way sort of destroyed a lot of good work that had been done originally. But it gave us the understanding of what was possible in order to bring about unity and unified action around real issues.
Wow. Ken, sure, please.
I don't want to talk too much, but I mean, Everett's going to be modest, but we should also add that after Evert became to Toronto, to Ottawa. He became on staff as a national rep and became ultimately the head of the social justice program of CUPW. So in answer to a previous question you raised about connections, I mean, I had the privilege of working with Evert when I was with the Social Justice Fund of the CIW in areas like Colombia. The issue there wasn't anti-racism as much as murder of trade unions.
Yes.
Predictable murder of trade unions. More trade unions killed in Colombia than any other country combined every year since 1990. So we worked together and talked together about how unions in Canada could give meaningful solidarity to the Colombian working class. But beyond that, East Timor. And the postal workers took on the East Timor issue like no other union in Canada. And that was under the direction of their international program, which Evert headed up. And I just want that to be properly acknowledged.
I would describe my role as being a coordinator rather than being the head of it. It was the result of a lot of very cooperative action from other militants within CUPW. Just in response to your comments about Colombia, one of the things that I think was really a reflection of how important the initial work that SACTU had done, the SACTU Solidarity done, was what we were able to do around building solidarity in Colombia amongst public sector workers. In fact, we were able to bring all of the 4 major public sector unions together to build a worker-to-worker solidarity movement that included the public sector and those elements in the private sector that were insisting that there should be public sector workers in Colombia. And that still goes on. It's an extremely long-lived program. It was called Defending Public. Now I'm trying to remember what the name of it was, but it was Colombian and Canadian workers on the front lines defending public services. And, Canadian and Colombian workers on the front lines, and it is still in operation. And I'm thinking that there are new possibilities given what's going on in Colombia right now with the elections. That there may be new possibilities for that program to be very effective.
And in a sense, you gave credit to SACTU Solidarity for being a bit of a role model here, is it?
Yes, no question about it.
How do you, can you just elaborate that a little bit?
As I think I mentioned earlier, that there was a lot of sense back before the SACTU Solidarity Committee of concern about international issues and what was happening to workers in other parts of the world. But just like with anti-apartheid, in our case, we had a policy against apartheid, but nothing that said what we could do to really make a difference, to join forces with workers in South Africa. That was the huge, one of the huge insights that was given as a result of the work of the SACTU Solidarity Committee, and that has been a key part of our international work ever since.
Thank you. Jane, please.
Just a couple of things. That same convention in 1986, part of the watershed also was voting against the paper that was presented by the CLC International Affairs Department, a standing vote, and to the amazement, I'm sure, of the International Affairs Department and probably a number of others, the vote was successful in defeating the paper and sending it back, and partially because of its failure to recognize SACTU, and it's also its failure to recognize the leading trade unions in Nicaragua and other struggles like Chile. And as I understand it, thereafter, the CLC International Affairs Department never really recovered. And far more than just CUPW began to determine their own way of internationalism and international solidarity, rather than the reliance which previously had been there on the CLC International Affairs Department. That was one. And I wondered if you recall any other actions, either on the docks or challenging South African products, liquor stores or grocery stores, any of those kind of memories?
Yeah, I do remember in particular a case where two activists went into a liquor store and very ceremoniously smashed a bottle on the floor of South African wine, I think it was, and got a fair amount of press coverage as a result of it. But a fair amount of criticism as well, because they hadn't really tried to organize anything around it that would have gained a lot more support had people known that this was something that could be done. And there was, I can't remember any specific issues with grocery stores, but I'm sure there was something. There was things going on at that point as well. And just on your comment about the International Affairs Department, yes, you're right. That was that convention was broke the back of the control of the International Affairs Department. And people, as I say, like Bob White were coming up, who were much more prepared to look at the importance of really integrating an international perspective to the CLC. And it tells me something really important about being part of the CLC. That even though it can be extremely frustrating to have to deal from time to time with the misleadership of the elite union leaders, the CLC also is made up of unions and union members. And every once in a while something happens that shows that they can show that they have a considerable amount of influence in what happens, and gives me the impression that it's what is possible in the future. And I think, I'm reasonably disappointed in what's been happening in the labor movement in the CLC in the last few years. But I do think that it's really important to stick in there and make sure that we do what is necessary to organize on the ground with workers who happen to be represented by unions who are part of the CLC.
And I think also, to Jane's point, the CLC International Department lost such credibility that they had to go outside of the organized labor to find an NGO person who had experience in working in Southern Africa, Paul Purett, to take over a lot of the responsibilities for Southern African connections by the CLC. And he brought with him the anti-communist politics of a group called Ticklesack in Toronto. So there were consequences for having defeated John Harker and his ICFTU approach, but nonetheless, we had to deal with that as well.
And this ties in a little bit with the question I was going to ask or raise for discussion, and that is, Evert, it's really impressive the kind of things that the unions were doing and the amount of education and the impact they had, and yet there's so little mention of that history in the common monologue that goes on out there about the dominant dialogue, as they call it. Do you think you made an impact? Why is it not talked about?
Oh, that's a difficult question, and we could spend a lot of time, I think, on the question of why these issues aren't front and center in the discussions about trade unions. I'm not really the person that should answer the question of whether I made an impact. I'll leave that to others to sort of comment on. But I think that we live in a world that is pretty difficult for trade unionists, particularly for trade unionists that want to talk about the relationship of trade unionism to the dominant political and economic system that exists in the world. So it's not a surprise to me that that's suppressed in a way. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to do what's necessary to do to confront that.
Oh no, I'm a very glass half full kind of guy, and I'm going to keep going. But I like to. It's been an interesting aspect of this work that these are stories that haven't been told, and that we're the ones doing it, even in our antiquity. And
Just to sort of underscore that, my union has also now embarked on a oral history project. It's being organized by Michael Ostroff, who's a very well-known videographer and a progressive as well. So I've just spent 8 hours 2 weeks ago talking generally about what life was like as a trade unionist all the way from when I started to when I retired. And there was a whole series of other people that are being interviewed at the same time.
that's fantastic. Jane, you have a pitch about paraphernalia and memorabilia and all of that?
Yes, our first deposit to Library and Archives Canada included those orange and black newsletters that everybody would recognize in their mail. We found almost all of, maybe all of them by now, both English and French. Buttons, posters, those, we used to call them banners or tea towel.
T-shirts.
T-shirts that we sold across the country, pins to raise the money that ran the office, because all of the strike fund money went overseas to SAC2, and so we had to find ways to keep, buying paper, etc. But one of the things that we're trying to track down as an aid to future researchers, educators, is where archives, in particular, local union newspapers might be. So do you have any idea, for example, where CUPW's Vancouver local newspaper might be stored? Because that's where we're finding not only articles, but also photographs of guests who came to speak at local union meetings, etc. Do you have any idea where those might be stored?
Well, some of them are actually at national office, but only up to a certain date. Some of them will still be back in Vancouver, and the archives at national office are in flux at the moment. We actually have, the National Union decided to actually hire someone who knows what they're doing with respect to archives, and that should assist us. But it means that things are very much in disarray for at least another 6 months, I think, probably. In Vancouver, there's probably some stuff from the 1980s that exists, because we don't have that national office at this time. So what I might do when I'm out there is find out from the local whether they have boxes that they've stored away somewhere with the 1980s material, and there might be some stuff in there.
Well, that'd be wonderful. That'd be wonderful. It's all good grist for the mill here, and brings out the struggle in a very real way when we can get the handle on these, even resolutions in union minutes that favor these kinds of things. That's gives reality to this solidarity in a sense. I guess we're getting close to the finale, folks. Any last questions, Ken, Jane, and Everett, please?
Just to thank Evert for his years of work on behalf of workers all over the world. Not just South Africa, but in Canada, of course, too. a real local leader who became a national figure.
Well, the thanks goes back to you folks as well, to the inspiration that you created that made it so much easier for us to do our work in the locals.
And for me, it's been a real honor and privilege to talk to so many people that were involved in such an important way. So I thank you again for your participation, and wish you a good day.
Well,
Let's
thank
get
you.
out and enjoy that sun.
It's been great.
Take care, Everett.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you bet.
good to see you again.
Yeah.
Thanks, Everett.
Bye-bye.